Remoteness might be taken for granted when it comes to the Adirondack Park, but because this concept can be ambiguous, advocates for this vast stretch of upstate property are looking for an updated, formal way to measure and preserve remoteness in the region. For more on this effort, we're joined on the Capitol Press Room by John Sheehan, Director of Communications for the Adirondack Council. Thanks for making the time, John.
Thank you, David.
Well, I want to talk about the status quo right now because a couple years ago, the Adirondack Park Agency mapped all the quote-unquote remote areas in the Adirondack Park, those areas at least 3 miles from a road and at least 2 miles from any lake where motorbikes might be allowed. I believe just a very tiny fraction of the park then met that criteria. So I guess I'm curious, what do you think about the current understanding of remoteness in the Adirondack Park and its adequacy?
Well, I think that people would be shocked if they realized that less than 5% of the Adirondacks are more than a few miles from a public road or a snowmobile trail. If we're talking about getting away from motorboats, that can be even more difficult. Of the top 100 lakes in the Adirondacks in terms of size, only 2 are actually off limits to motorboats or are far enough away that you can't actually launch one there. So a great majority of land in the park and water in the park is accessible by motors. And even if it's not being used that way every day, the impact of having motors and people regularly in those spaces tends to change the environment and the ecosystem in ways that we haven't really understood until the last decade or so.
Well, then what should be done about this? Should we be curtailing the use of, say, motorboats in certain bodies of water? Because I don't imagine we can do a lot about, say, the roads that are already laid down throughout the park. So what are you looking to happen moving forward?
Well, there are some opportunities on all fronts, actually. There are roads that are unnecessary in the Adirondacks that are maintained or loosely maintained because there is a sense that people want to keep them. But in many cases, that is not necessarily true. While there might be an advocate or two who is obsessed with that particular pathway, the general public not using it for decades at a time is a pretty good vote on whether they feel that it's needed or not. Whether somebody lives on that, it makes a difference, obviously, but we're generally talking about land in the forest preserve, public lands that are off limits to development, that are essentially publicly owned and protected by the state constitution. Getting into the back country of the park can be difficult, especially in wilderness areas, but generally there are roads paralleling wilderness in wild forest areas of the park and public highways that go between the two fairly regularly in a very steady pattern across the Adirondacks. There are only a few places with big blocks of forest preserve that don't have roads on them, and generally they make up a tiny fraction of the overall landscape. Wildlife Conservation Society did some work not so long ago about what the impact was of a new home in a pristine location. The home would come with a driveway, some exterior lighting, and the presence of people, so some noise and disturbance on a fairly regular basis. Each home envelope studied created about 30 acres of disturbance, even though the house only occupied a tiny fraction of 1 acre of land. So the footprint became quite large, even though the expectation was that only a small portion of the land had been developed, so perhaps it would only affect a small portion of the wildlife in the region. Sadly, birds and other species that don't do well around human beings tend to flee immediately and change the very landscape itself by their lack of presence. So this is it's an issue for habitat. It's an issue for continued biological diversity in the park. And there are places where we can make this better. So whether it's a roadway or a lake that's been essentially always available to motors, there's decisions that can be made, especially on places completely surrounded by forest preserve.
What about the definitions that we're using? I mentioned 3 miles from a road, 2 miles from a lake where motorboats are allowed. I mean, those numbers seem kind of arbitrary, especially for anyone who lives in a even slightly populated area. So Why not just scale back our expectations of what remoteness actually is under these standards?
Well, I think that we're trying to do this based on science rather than how people feel about it. And that's not intuitively something that would be obvious in this discussion, but remoteness is more than just a feeling. It's an area that is essentially not affected by human interaction, where people are visitors that stay a very short period of time and don't leave obvious marks on the landscape. We can measure how much of that's out there right now, and as the state is doing its business with management of the forest preserve, essentially updating unit management plans and making periodic changes to the state land master plan, we want the state to be conscious of the need to create more remote locations, places where nature is the only influence or the absolute dominant influence, and one that is not essentially being damaged or affected in a material way by what human beings are doing on that same landscape. And this takes a little bit of self-restraint. This is essentially reminding ourselves that we're not always a positive influence every time we step into the woods, and that we need to be careful about what that impact can be long term.
What about the idea that the Adirondack Park needs, say, additional housing, or there's this idea that we should be trying to figure out how to build the economy here? Are you concerned at all that some of these efforts, when we talk about ensuring remoteness, could undermine some of those efforts and that we're putting too much emphasis on remoteness than the needs of maybe the people who live and try to work there?
I think that they can work together quite nicely, actually.
Okay.
One of the principles of sustainable development, especially sustainable housing, is to put it in places where you already have other amenities, where it would be least expensive to build the building and for people to get to that building while also getting to other things like work and the supermarket and the daycare center and school. And this is something that's been a challenge in the Adirondacks for a long time, because a lot of people who want second homes in the Adirondacks are looking at being out in the country as far as they can get. But people who live and work in the park full time
Hmm.
need a place that is going to work for them as a resident of the park, and someone who can afford to live and work and play in the Adirondacks, but don't have the means of people in the second home community who can go out and buy themselves a residence in addition to the one that they need every day to live in.
And so the next steps in this mission would fall to the Adirondack Park Agency. What is it you're looking for them to do?
Initially, just creating a better inventory of remoteness right now, and to essentially keep that definition and the current conditions in mind as it makes management decisions about areas of the forest preserve in the future. There are about 100 individual units of the Adirondack Forest Preserve that each have their own individualized plan, and those unit management plans get periodically updated. Over the last decade or two, most of those updates have been things that added public recreation pressure to the land without really having a baseline of what the impact of that pressure is already. So I think part of what we're asking for overall in state land master planning in the park is more consciousness that there are fewer and fewer very remote places in the park, that adding especially motorized recreation in places that currently don't have it can make those places even smaller, and try to concentrate those in locations where people would actually use them and not create essentially what becomes a nuisance to the forest preserve's long-term health. If we take a look at things like where people hunt and fish in the Adirondack Park, we get a pretty good sense of recreational use of a certain kind. And what we find is on foot, people tend not to travel much more than 3/4 of a mile, half a mile into the woods to kill a deer, for example. Whether they need to get farther by vehicle really depends on where they're going to find deer. And the deeper into the woods you go, the higher in elevation you go, the fewer deer you're going to find. But those locations could be very remote and isolated from civilization if we have essentially the discipline not to keep building roads into them and when we have the opportunity to take away roads that are there and let them revert to foot trails. We've seen this happen in places like Boreas Ponds, where the state purchased new land for the forest preserve that had an old road network on it that was used as vacation land for a timber company. We can make decisions like that in other places in the park, reroute snowmobile trails, which is part of what the state had said it was going to do over the last decade or so, is to take away the ones that aren't being used, the isolated loops that don't really go anywhere, and create more travel corridors closer to highways that make it easier to get from one community to the next. That makes sense to us. The only thing we objected to in all of that was in that process, the state started building what looked more like highways than snowmobile trails, and they got into trouble with removal of timber, and the Court of Appeals agreed that they had gone a little too far in that regard. So still trying to find a happy medium on that, but I think part of this planning is going to be the preservation of remoteness as the goal, and finding routes that make the least disturbance on wilderness and remote areas as they plan where motorized transportation and recreation should happen.
Well, we've been speaking with John Sheehan. He's the Director of Communications for the Adirondack Council. John, thank you so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure, David.
Fraud and lawsuit abuse raise car insurance costs for New Yorkers. Reforms are being proposed to mitigate their impact, but some Albany leaders want to keep the status quo. Information on these reforms is available at keepnewyorkaffordable.org.
Support for the Capitol Press Room is provided by New York State United Teachers, a statewide union of nearly 700,000 professionals in education and healthcare.